The brutal final moments of William Wallace in English Captivity. The sentence had 5 parts. If you watched the previous video in this series, you know what those 5 parts were and why each one existed. The legal framework, the charges, the deliberate political architecture that Edward I had constructed to transform a Scottish resistance fighter into an English traitor. If you haven't watched it, the short version is this. William Wallace stood in Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, heard 5 charges read against him in Latin, was denied the right to speak in his own defense, and received a sentence that was not one punishment but a sequence of 5 distinct legal penalties, each one corresponding to a specific crime, each one to be administered in order in public at Smithfield. What this script is about is what those 5 penalties actually meant, not legally, not politically, physically. Because the history of William Wallace, in the films, in the textbooks, in the Scottish nationalist tradition that has carried his name across 7 centuries, tends to arrive at the execution and describe it in one of 2 ways. Either a brief factual statement that he was hanged, drawn, and quartered, which tells you what happened without telling you what it meant, or a dramatic rendering that reaches for emotional impact without grounding itself in the specific documented reality of what the human body experiences when subjected to this sequence of procedures. What follows is neither of those things. It is a reconstruction, built from the medical literature, the legal records, the chronicles of the period, and the physical evidence that historians and forensic researchers have assembled over the past century of what August 23, 1305 actually was at Smithfield. This is not comfortable reading. It was not designed to be. Start with the dragging. Because the dragging was not prologue to the execution. It was, as Script 2 established, the first legal penalty, the sentence for treason itself, being administered from the moment Wallace left the Tower of London until the moment he arrived at Smithfield. The distance from the Tower to Smithfield, by the route that London streets would have required in 1305, was approximately 2.5 miles. Wallace was bound, hands secured behind him or to a frame, the accounts vary in their specificity, and attached by rope to a horse that moved at walking pace through streets that had been arranged by the authorities managing the event to be lined with spectators. 2.5 miles at walking pace takes roughly 45 minutes to an hour, depending on crowd management and the pace of the horse. This matters because the dragging was not simply a matter of being pulled across ground. It was 45 minutes of sustained physical trauma that would have significant consequences for everything that followed. The surface of London streets in 1305 was not smooth. The primary paving material in the medieval city was cobblestone, irregular, hard, with joints between stones that represented significant discontinuities in the surface. Being dragged across cobblestone at walking pace, bound and unable to protect the body from impact, produces a specific and compounding pattern of injury. The back and the back of the skull bear the primary contact. Skin abrades first, within the first few hundred yards. Beneath the skin, the tissue over the bony prominences of the spine, the shoulder blades, the back of the skull, takes repeated impact trauma that produces bruising, then deeper injury accumulating over the full length of the route. The medieval physician John of Ardern, whose surgical writings from the period are among the primary sources for understanding 13th and 14th century trauma medicine, described the injuries produced by dragging in clinical terms that reflect direct observation of the condition. He noted that men who survived the dragging, prisoners dragged shorter distances for lesser offenses and then released, required weeks of treatment for the wounds produced, and that the most serious cases involved damage to the back of the skull that produced altered states of consciousness. Wallace was dragged 2.5 miles. By the time he arrived at Smithfield, his physical condition was already significantly compromised. This is not incidental to what followed. It is the context in which everything that followed must be understood. At Smithfield, the scaffold had been prepared, a wooden platform elevated enough to be visible to the assembled crowd. The crowd itself, several hundred people at minimum, possibly more, because the execution of Wallace was a significant public event that Edward's officials had publicized, was already present when the horse arrived. The first penalty at Smithfield was hanging. Medieval hanging in 1305 was not the long drop hanging of 19th and 20th century penal practice, where the condemned person falls a calculated distance that produces death by cervical fracture within seconds. Long drop hanging was developed specifically to produce quick, humane death, and its development was a 19th century innovation. In 1305, hanging meant a short drop, often as little as a few inches, followed by death by slow asphyxiation as the weight of the body compressed the structures of the neck. Death by this method, in cases where it was allowed to proceed to completion, typically took between 10 and 20 minutes. The body's involuntary responses during this period, the muscular spasms, the involuntary movements that medieval observers described without clinical vocabulary, were visible to everyone present. But Wallace was not hanged to death. He was hanged to the point of near death, cut down while still alive, still conscious in some degree, still capable of experiencing what came next. The distinction between these two outcomes is physiologically significant and was legally required by the sentence, which specified that the remaining penalties were to be administered while the condemned man was still living. The degree of consciousness that survives near hanging depends on several variables: the duration of the hanging, the specific compression of the carotid arteries versus the jugular veins, the individual's physiological responses. What the medical literature establishes is that consciousness can be partial and fluctuating after near hanging, and that the pain responses of the body can persist even when the capacity for coherent experience has been compromised. The accounts of Wallace's hanging at Smithfield are brief in the chronicles. The English chroniclers who documented the event were not writing medical reports. They were writing political histories for readers who understood what hanging meant without requiring clinical explication. What the chronicles record is that he was cut down alive. What they do not record, because their authors had neither the vocabulary nor the interest to record it, is the physiological state of the man who was cut down. The second and third penalties were administered together in the documentary record, though the sentence distinguished them. The removal of the entrails and their burning, and the removal of the heart, liver, and lungs and their burning before the condemned man's eyes. These are the penalties that the condensed history of Wallace's execution mentions most briefly, and that the medical reality makes most difficult to describe accurately without either euphemism or gratuitous detail. What follows attempts to navigate between those two failures. The procedure was performed by men who had done it before. Execution at this level of complexity, the sequence of hanged, drawn, and quartered, was not common enough to be routine in the way that simple hanging was, but it had been performed at English executions of convicted traitors with sufficient frequency that there was an established procedure. The men at Smithfield were not improvising. The drawing, the evisceration, was the specific technical meaning of the word in the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered. The word drawn referred to drawing out the intestines and organs, not to the dragging, which was a separate element of the sentence. This distinction is frequently confused in popular accounts. The physiological reality of evisceration in a living person is documented in the medical literature from multiple historical contexts: surgical records, battlefield accounts, the clinical descriptions of early modern anatomists who were working from direct observation of the body's responses to major abdominal trauma. What that literature establishes is that the abdominal cavity contains nerve networks whose responses to major trauma produce pain of an intensity that the standard vocabulary of pain inadequately conveys, and that consciousness can persist through major abdominal trauma for longer than the untrained observer would expect. The burning of the removed organs before the condemned man's eyes, the specific element of the sentence designed to connect the punishment to the crime of sacrilege, the burning of sacred places, required that those organs be burned in proximity to the scaffold where the man was being held. The accounts confirm this happened. The Lanercost Chronicle, one of the more detailed English sources for the execution, records the burning. It does not elaborate on what the man on the scaffold experienced during it. What it records instead, and this detail appears in at least 2 independent chronicle sources, which gives it more credibility than the details that appear in only one, is that Wallace did not cry out. That through the dragging, through the hanging, through the drawing, The witnesses who were present did not record him crying out in the way that the procedure was, in some sense, designed to produce. This is remarkable enough that the chroniclers noted it. Men who were writing histories designed to validate Edward's authority, who had no interest in making Wallace seem admirable, found his bearing worth recording. The beheading followed. For the outlawry charge, the status of outlaw that had been declared against Wallace years before his capture, meaning he had been legally placed outside the king's peace and could be killed by anyone without legal consequence, the sentence prescribed decapitation. By the time this penalty was administered, the preceding procedures had already done their work on the body. The beheading at this stage was, in the physiological sense, the least complex element of what had been happening at Smithfield. A sufficiently sharp blade, properly applied, severs the cervical vertebrae and the structures of the neck in a single stroke. Medieval execution blades were maintained for this purpose. The procedure, if competently performed, was the quickest death available at this stage of what had been happening since morning. His head was then fixed on London Bridge. This was not informal. This was prescribed by the sentence. The display of the head was the final visible element of the execution, the one that would remain visible to everyone entering London from the south for weeks or months after the day of execution. London Bridge was the primary entrance to the city from the south side of the Thames, and the display of traitors' heads on its gatehouse was an established practice that served the same function as the procession and the public execution: maximum visibility, continuous communication of the message. Wallace's head was treated with pitch before being fixed to the bridge. The pitch was preservative. It slowed decomposition and extended the period during which the display remained recognizable rather than simply organic matter. The specific duration for which Wallace's head remained on London Bridge is not recorded in the chronicles with precision. Similar displays from the period are documented as lasting for periods ranging from several weeks to several months, depending on weather conditions and the authorities' assessment of when the message had been sufficiently communicated. The quartering, the division of the body into 4 pieces, produced the elements that were sent to the 4 cities that Script 2 identified: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The selection of these 4 cities was not arbitrary. Newcastle was the primary English administrative center for the border region, the city through which English military authority in the north was projected. Berwick was the Scottish city most associated with the English conquest, the city whose fall in 1296 had marked the beginning of the occupation that Wallace had spent his life resisting. Stirling was the site of Wallace's greatest military victory, the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where a Scottish force had defeated a much larger English army in a way that humiliated Edward and made Wallace famous across Scotland and beyond. And Perth was the administrative heart of central Scotland, the city whose population would understand most directly what the displayed remains signified. Each city was being sent a message. The messages were not all the same. To Newcastle and Berwick, English-controlled territory, the message was, "This is what English authority does to those who resist it." To Stirling, the site of Wallace's triumph, the message was, "The man who won here ended here." To Perth, the heart of the country he had defended, the message was, "Look at what remains of the man you followed." Edward I understood communication. He had spent his reign building legal institutions, administrative systems, and military infrastructure that were, by the standards of his time, genuinely impressive. He was not a simple brute. He was a calculating political operator who used violence as a tool with the same deliberateness he used law. The distribution of Wallace's remains was the final element of a communication strategy that had begun with the public trial at Westminster Hall and proceeded through every stage of the day at Smithfield. Every element, the public rout, the assembled crowd, the sequential penalties, the burning of the organs, the head on London Bridge, the 4 quarters to 4 cities, was part of a single coherent message addressed to Scotland. The message was, "This is over." It wasn't. Within a year of Wallace's execution, Robert Bruce had claimed the Scottish throne. Within 9 years, the Scottish army had destroyed an English force at Bannockburn in the most decisive military defeat Edward II ever suffered. Within 19 years of the execution at Smithfield, Scotland had won the First War of Independence. The message that Edward I had constructed with such care and delivered with such thoroughness had failed to produce the outcome it was designed to produce. And here is the thing about that failure that is most worth understanding, because it is the thing that makes Wallace's execution historically significant rather than simply historically terrible. Edward had understood correctly that ideas need carriers, that resistance movements need symbols, that the execution of a symbol, done publicly, done thoroughly, done with enough visibility that no one could claim they hadn't seen it, could destroy the idea that the symbol carried. What he had not understood was that the method he chose to destroy the symbol was so extreme, so elaborate, so visibly in excess of what simple execution required, that it communicated something he had not intended to communicate. It communicated the measure of what he feared. A king who needed 5 legal penalties to kill one man, who needed to drag him through 2.5 miles of city streets, who needed his heart burned and his head displayed and his body sent in pieces to 4 cities, that king was not executing a criminal. That king was trying to destroy an idea. And the scale of the effort told everyone watching exactly how powerful the idea was. Edward won the day at Smithfield in every measurable sense. He killed Wallace. He displayed the remains. He administered the sentence to the letter. And in doing so with such thoroughness, such elaborateness, such visible determination to leave nothing of Wallace intact, he told Scotland precisely how much Wallace had frightened him. That information outlasted the body. It always does. The brutal final moments of William Wallace in English Captivity. The sentence had 5 parts. Episode 2 of this series covered the trial. The charges read in Latin, the right of defense he was denied, the legal machinery Edward I built to turn a Scottish resistance fighter into an English traitor. If you haven't watched it, go back. This video is what came after the verdict. 2.5 miles of cobblestone streets, a scaffold at Smithfield, 5 legal penalties administered in sequence, each one corresponding to a specific crime. The dragging, the hanging, not to death, but close enough that what followed was still possible. The drawing, the beheading, the quartering, and then 4 cities, each receiving a piece of the message Edward needed Scotland to read. The history books give you the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered and move on. This video doesn't move on. This is what those 3 words meant, rebuilt from the medical literature, the legal records, and the chronicles of men who were there. And at the end, the thing that made Edward's elaborate communication strategy fail completely. He told Scotland exactly how much Wallace had frightened him. Subscribe for more dark, untold history. New videos every week.